Hi, and welcome to our next video on Semantics Pragmatics. This week on conceptual metaphors. From the introductory classes to linguistics, you'll probably remember that a metaphor describes the situation when one concept is understood or conceptualized in terms of another based on their similarity. We talk about a source and a target domain when we talk about metaphors. The source domain is typically more concrete one, physical one, whereas the target domain is a more abstract, more psychological sphere of meaning. And by a metaphorical extension, or by using an expression in a metaphorical sense, we apply the source domain to the target domain. Very well-known examples of metaphorical meaning are expressions such as, for example, when we say that stock prices are falling, where we use the conceptual metaphor of a concrete situation here described by the verb falling, to fall, where obviously high, up, is meant as good, whereas down is meant as bad. And if you think about that, up and down on their own are simply words describing the location, where something is. But what we do is we use these concrete expressions, source domain, to mean something more abstract. In this case, up means more, down means less, up means better, down means worse, and so forth. Right? So more is up, less is down. This would be one way to describe this metaphor. Another well-known example is probably in all introductory classes on metaphors, something like our relationship has reached a dead end. Right, where the concrete thing is dead end, road, reaching a goal, and so forth, while the abstract thing is the relationship, right? And the conceptual metaphor that stands behind this expression is commonly described as love is a journey. When we talk about metaphors, and in particular about conceptual metaphors, there are two names that are particularly important: George Lakov and Mark Johnson. Those two researchers were instrumental in starting the cognitive turn in linguistics and in starting to looking in more detail into the nature of metaphors. Together they published a book called Metaphors We Live By, a very known, very famous title. They published it in 1980s, and in 1987 George Lakov alone then published another very important book called Women, Fire and Dangerous Things: What Categories Reveal About the Mind. And in those books, and also in other works, one of the things that they wanted to show, and that they showed, was that metaphors are not something exceptional, but metaphors are all over the place. The title of the second book, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things, by the way, is a reference to the grammatical system of an Australian Aboriginal language called Gerbil, that has famously 4 noun classes, similar to the Indo-European gender system, where you distinguish between the masculine, feminine, and neutral classes of words, or nouns. In Gerbil, you have the class 1, that is restricted for men and animate objects. Then there is the class 2, which is restricted for women, water, fire, and violence. Then there is the class 3, describing edible fruit and vegetables. And then class 4 that describes basically everything that is not in the first 3 classes. So just to clear why the book bears this title, right? And even this is sort of conceptualizing classes like that. There are incremental in the language also tell us something about how we think. And that's another important point of when dealing with conceptual metaphors. It's not only about language, but also how we think about or what we convey by using certain expressions, very often unconsciously, right? So the speakers of gerbil, they don't necessarily they don't necessarily say that women are dangerous or just as water and fire, but it does tell us something about how the speakers of that language conceptualize the world around them. Okay. And this is another central aspect that we have already touched upon during our discussions this semester. So the relationship between language and thought. So, and if we, in this context, talk about metaphors, what has traditionally been the case was that metaphor is a figure of speech, a tool that is used in writing poetry or other high literature, using an everyday word in a very special way, something that big authors do, right? So, for example, Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, and so forth. But what Lakov and Johnson, among others, have shown us is that metaphors are omnipresent in our language. Actually, when we talk, we almost inadvertently have to use metaphorical language. And we don't even realize that we do that. What is also important is the realization that distinguishing between a literal and a metaphorical meaning of an expression is very difficult. The question is actually whether this distinction really makes sense. Because what lies behind that idea is that sort of literal uses of a word are the base, and metaphorical meaning are somehow derived from that and not as common, right? The idea is also very often that literal meanings of expressions of words are listed up in a dictionary, and metaphorical meaning is something else. This is not as simple as the reality is not as simple as we would like it to be. And because even such basic concepts as category, time, quantity are in fact metaphorical. Time is being conceptualized as a movement, right? Quantity can be also conceptualized as a position somewhere. And category can be conceptualized and is conceptualized as a container. Something is inside a category and something is outside of a category. The same way you can have cookies in a jar and you can have cookies outside of a jar. So when we talk about metaphors, we definitely, to a degree, talk about the language and how it's being used. But also, and maybe actually predominantly, we talk about thinking. Because we think in metaphors. We not only speak metaphorically. And when we say that we think in metaphors, it also means that we think in analogies, right? So something is, to a degree, similar to something else, right? Remember this abstract and concrete target and source domain. And one example that I would like to shortly discuss with you here, but really only very briefly, is the example of relationships as journeys and dead-end streets. So we've already had this sentence, our relationship or our relation has hit a dead-end street. Or things like we have to keep going, right? Again, this idea of you have to go somewhere as a metaphorical way to say we have to continue, not stop doing whatever we're doing. Or we're preparing for a bumpy ride, right? Again, this metaphor of a journey, of a ride, of a road, and so forth. So what we have here is that a romantic relationship / love is here being conceptualized as a journey. And this is obviously not the end of it, right? So there are many other examples of ways how a romantic relationship, how a love relationship can be conceptualized, expressed in terms of journey or ride, drive, whatever, boats. And we can actually, this is not everything we can say about that, right? So we can, for example, have a look at how are the individual parts of these expressions actually conceptualized, right? So, and we see that lovers, right, are conceptualized as travelers. So people who are involved in a relationship are then seen as travelers. They are those who are going from somewhere to somewhere else. The relationship itself is then seen as the vehicle that the lovers use to get to their destination, right? And I specifically say vehicle because it can be a boat, it can be a car, it can be a bicycle, it can be whatever we can think of. It can be a plane, a balloon, whatever. And then we have the lover's goals as the common destination, right? So a bright future where the couple is headed, right? So what we've seen in this video is that a metaphor is a tool that allows us to understand one concept, one meaning, in terms of another one, based on some degree of similarity, right? So the source and the target domain have to have something in common, some feature. And then the source domain, the concrete physical meaning, is understood as standing for something more abstract, the target domain. And we conceptualize something as something else. The important thing is that metaphors and metaphorical language are not the outliers. They are an integral part of our everyday language use, and that means that it's not something out of the ordinary, but this is the normal thing we do. And if we use these expressions, we automatically also think in those concepts, right? So if we all the time say that if we speak about relationships in a way that is like speaking about a journey, about a road, then we also think about relationships that way. And so here we see another very interesting aspect where language and thinking are interconnected. We'll see more about that in our live session. But before it comes to that, thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.